Welcome into Husker Max today. I'm Kaleb Henry. That's Nick Handley. It is March, and that means the weather's supposed to be getting nicer. Baseball's coming back to Nebraska. Maybe. We'll talk about that a little bit later as the Big Red go 1-2 down in Frisco. Had a 5-0 lead on LSU for a while before the wheels kind of came off there. Nebraska men's basketball suffers a setback despite the massive 19-point deficit they climbed out of. And there were a few Huskers at the NFL Combine. I think a couple of them, Nick, may have helped their draft stock, but we're going to start with Husker women's hoops and voice of Nebraska women's basketball, Matt Coatney, after a stomping of Northwestern to close out the regular season. Matt, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, it's March Madness. That's always my favorite time of the year. The weather's warm. It hasn't started snowing yet. Let's do it. I love this time of year.
Well, we got the bracket for the Big Ten tournament, and I want to take a peek at that. But first, just that game in Evanston to close out the regular season after you had the comeback win to get to overtime against Oregon, the Washington game, and then Northwestern to close it out. Just how do you feel the momentum is for this team closing out the regular season that way?
Well, I think you said the correct word there, momentum. Nebraska needed it after the two games that Britt Prince missed. Getting her back was key heading into the Big Ten tournament. She missed 2 games with the ankle injury, suffered very late in the loss at Illinois. And it was a feel-good win. Nebraska needed some positive momentum. Their offense looked as good as it's looked all year with Britt Prince in the lineup, and just a monster effort by Alexis Markowski, who is playing her best basketball of her exceptional career at the end of her senior year. So it was a feel-good win, no doubt about it, and what Nebraska needed heading into March Madness.
Yeah, Matt, before we get to the first half that this team had and what they needed to against a team like Northwestern, you mentioned Britt Prince. She's out for a little bit. I even mentioned this last week that I was hoping maybe she had missed even the most recent game, more of a precautionary measure, but you're watching her get back in the flow of things. Did it seem like she, as far as her overall physical health, her wind, all of those things, when you do have a brief layoff, was all of that seemingly good and feeling good about the postseason now?
If I didn't know anything had happened to her, I wouldn't have known there was ever a problem. She moved very quickly. She was in passing lanes. She attacked off the bounce without any hesitation. Her push step and her lateral movement was exceptional. So I actually thought it was great to get her back in the lineup so Nebraska knew what they had, and she, I think, is 100% ready to move forward.
You've dealt with and seen this team deal with injuries all season. Britt ultimately missing just a couple of games, but you saw Allison Widener go down earlier in the year, and Natalie Potts, and Amy Williams has had to go through and kind of shuffle this lineup at different times based on availability. But you didn't have to worry about Alexis Markowski, like you said, playing some of her best basketball. 35 points against Oregon, makes several threes, has 19 points in the first half against Washington before tweaking her back, and then 30 points yesterday. How much has Alexis, one, just both grown because she's had to and she's a senior, but also under the conditions of the team at the end of this season is not the team that you were hoping that they would have all of those pieces there from the beginning of the season?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think if you take a look at the timeline, the offense that Amy Williams hoped to have this year would have Natalie Potts and Alexis Markowski as their bigs. And that only happened for 4 games. And then Nebraska needed to learn how to play without Natalie Potts, which is, you're a different team. But you also have a freshman point guard as good as Britt Prince is, who's learning how to get the ball to Alexis Markowski, when to deliver it, and in what are the best situations. And they developed some of that over the summer, developed that with Potts in the lineup. Not only do you lose Potts, now you have a freshman learning how to play with Markowski. And I think it's all kind of coming together at the right time in late February and early March. But Markowski has certainly put this team on her back, and she knows that the clock is ticking on her college career. And I think what we're seeing is a woman who is trying to maximize every second that she has remaining.
Coat, man, I want to talk about that game again yesterday because you have a Northwestern team. They've had minimal success, but it's a team that is going to throw everything out there. It's senior day for them as well. That can be an uncomfortable situation, especially when the health of the team is still a little bit up in the air. I go back to what Kaleb brought up of Alexis's start and the type of game that she ended up having, but this team collectively getting off to a great start, because in a little bit, we're going to talk about the men's team that is not getting off to great starts, and it's coming back to bite them. In games like this, and you've seen so much basketball, those types of games, I don't want to call them a trap game, but they can be very uncomfortable when you're facing a team like Northwestern with that health. How big was just the first really the first quarter, but the first half of this game, and feeling a lot better about how this was going to play out?
It's a great point, Nick. And I'll tell you, Joe McEwen is a Hall of Fame coach, and you can look at Northwestern's record, but realize they've been in just about every game this year, but they were playing for something. If they defeated Nebraska and got a little bit of help, then they would make the Big Ten tournament, because not every team makes it this year. Annie Williams, I give her so much credit. At the morning shoot-around, she stood in the middle of that circle and said the most physical team will win this game. And the team took it to heart. Jessica Petrie was a monster yesterday. We can talk about Markowski's game. Logan Nisley got a ton of rebounds. Birdie Rimdahl came in and was aggressive off the bounce, hit 5 threes. So the start certainly was something. You get a team that's lower in the ratings. It's their senior day. If you let them hang around, just about anything can happen. And Nebraska turned that faucet off very quickly.
So the Huskers go ahead, and they'd already locked up a bid to, because you have to lock up a bid to the conference tournament now with the 18 teams in top 15. Huskers finished tied for 8th, and because of the tiebreakers, ultimately get the 10 seed. Matt, and we've got the bracket pulled up for those watching on YouTube right now as well. Huskers will take on Rutgers in the second game on Wednesday following Minnesota-Washington. Then Wisconsin-Iowa will be the third game that day. USC is the top seed, UCLA the 2 seed, followed by Ohio State and Maryland. For the Huskers, if they are going to make a run through this bracket, Coatney, what do they have to obviously make sure happens on Wednesday, but then potentially going forward against Illinois and UCLA?
Well, getting by Rutgers isn't going to be easy. Nebraska beat Rutgers in New Jersey, but that was tough because Kyomie McMiller put 35 on Nebraska, I think it was, that day. She's not been playing the last 5 games. She's kind of been a national story. She's been suspended. She's kind of went in the witness protection program. Also, Awas Sidibe, their good penetrating guard, has been out injured as of late. If Nebraska can get by Rutgers, they owe Illinois. That was a tough game in Champaign just a couple of weeks ago. It was a game Britt Prince got hurt in late. It was a 9-point game, but really it was a possession game until free throws were the story of the game at the end. So Nebraska's actually got a decent path to that third game, but UCLA, my goodness, they are. If Nebraska plays UCLA, the Huskers will have been coming off 2 consecutive games. UCLA would have had a week break. They are coming off a loss to USC, where they lost a chance at least a share of the conference title. So UCLA is going to be ready. Trust me, they are going to be ready. So if Nebraska gets to UCLA, they will have no rest in taking on one of the top teams in the nation. And you look at that bracket. That 15-team bracket, that almost looks like an NCAA tournament.
Right.
It's like the warm-up act right now. That is a tough tournament. If you want to come out of day one, you're going to have to win 5 straight days. It's like the McCann Death March of tournaments.
Well, and it's a good thing to get into, because this is now the first year we're seeing this expanded Big Ten. And I know that we've talked about in a variety of sports, whether it's football, basketball on the men's and women's side, or even the ball bat sports, of how the West Coast teams are really going to impact this conference. Even volleyball, which we saw that as well. I think it's safe to say, Co-Man, that we're looking at, between USC and UCLA, not only the teams that they have, but really the individual star power. The profile of this conference just in this 1 year with the addition of these Western teams, these West Coast teams, has been huge for this sport. And I think a lot more eyeballs are going to be on this tournament. I mean, and that's saying, I get it. With Caitlin Clark in Iowa, there was a lot of external eyeballs outside of the conference interest on it. But even without Caitlin Clark, the individual star power and some of these great additional teams on top of the traditional teams that have been in the Big Ten, this is a huge year for the Big Ten right now.
It is. It's a great point. Juju Watkins, you can't turn on TV without seeing her trying to sell you car insurance. Lauren Betts and Kiki Rice for UCLA are major stars that come from Los Angeles. But how about the national game on Big Fox yesterday, early evening, with Maryland and Ohio State going to overtime and the dramatic shot that was hit to win the game, and then Cody McMahon giving a 2-finger salute to the fans. I mean, there's so much attention right now on women's basketball. Fans, this has been a huge year, and the Big Ten is projected to get, I can't even believe this, 13 teams in the NCAA tournament. I mean, you look at Nebraska, you look at Washington, Iowa, Minnesota, they're all in the play-in round, and they're solidly in the NCAA tournament. How good is this league to say you're in the bunny bracket and you don't have to worry about being in the NCAA tournament? It's just exceptional. And then there's 3 different networks going to be covering this. Peacock will have games, then Big Ten Network takes over, then Big CBS has the championship game, which Nebraska played last year in. So, it's an unbelievable time for not only women's basketball, but this particular league.
And so much of the NCAA tournament comes down to kind of who you get matched up with. You're right, Matt. There are multiple teams that are going to be playing on Wednesday that matchup dependent can make the second weekend, Nebraska being one of them.
Absolutely. And, if Nebraska is being projected as a 10 seed, in my mind, a 7 versus 10 is the same thing as an 8 versus 9. You can move teams up a notch or down a notch with the curves and the way they slide them around. It's basically a 50-50 matchup. And this conference sets every team up for success because every night you're playing a USC, a UCLA, a Maryland, an Ohio State. You're playing one of the best teams in the nation. So it's not a stretch to say, okay, well, you have to go in and play, a team that finished second in the Big East or the ACC. It's very similar to what Nebraska has seen all year. So the conference, getting through this league, and if you can get through that, the NCAA tournament is certainly not anything that you haven't seen already.
Coat, you've seen many Amy Williams teams, and I know that relationship that you have with her and the coaching staff is always a strong one. And not every year is created equal. With the injuries, with having to we just talked about Britt Prince being out for a little bit, Alexis Markowski having to leave the game with a back tweak and coming back. So not only the players that are out, but some of the players that are fighting through some pain and some nicks and here and there. What have you taken away from her leadership in this particular year, especially navigating some just devastating injuries and early on, and then what we just talked about, navigating through an even more competitive schedule?
Well, it's one of the best jobs that any coach has ever done. And one of the reasons is no one ever asked me this question. How did Amy Williams survive losing Jazz Shelley and still have the Huskers be successful this year?
Yeah.
You take a Jazz Shelley, who was really the focal part of this team, who had a great postseason last year, 3-year starter, and no one really even talks about that right now because Amy Williams has navigated the injuries and bringing in a Britt Prince, who's not the same kind of player as Jazz Shelley, but it really gets to the depth that Nebraska had at the start of the year to say, look, Allison Widener doesn't even have to start with this team. Nebraska can go 12 deep. The depth she has, the style she has, the culture she's developed here, and in working things around to make Britt Prince comfortable in playing with Alexis Markowski, it's one of her best coaching jobs, no doubt.
Well, Matt, we're looking forward to pulling that game up on Peacock on Wednesday and syncing it to the Huskers radio network because that's the only way that we like to take in our Husker hoops around here. So best of luck in Indianapolis and seeing that game, hoping to see the Huskers go on a run there, then hearing the name called this next Sunday for the NCAA tournament. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you for having me on.
There you go. Matt Coatney of the Huskers Radio Network, voice of Nebraska women's basketball. By the way, ESPN has Nebraska slotted in as a 10 seed headed to Baton Rouge to take on Louisville. There you go. That would be a little Danny Busboom Kelly Bowl down there in Baton Rouge. LSU, of course, would be the one of the other teams down there. Now on the other side, Nebraska men's basketball, as we transition between hoops teams, had a big opportunity on the weekend. And it was one of those games that you looked at maybe a little bit the same way for the women's team, Nick, in that it's a team that should be outmatched. You should have a big advantage. And for the men, they were at home at a time where you were looking at all of the bracketology, and we broke it down last Thursday. If you missed any of that, you can get it back on the YouTube page, on any of our podcast platforms. Spotify is the one that we tend to share quite a bit, but there was an opportunity to go and almost lock up a bid to the NCAA tournament, a return trip, back-to-back years for the first time since 93 and 94, headed to March Madness. Instead, got down real quick, and it ballooned to 19. And then you had it was a 25-6 run or something incredible in the second half. You get a wild last minute, and ultimately opportunity blown and disappointment because of, one, what was in front of you in a different way than Michigan, and two, because it should have been a team that this squad under Fred Hoiberg with Bryce Williams and Juwan Gary and all of these pieces should have beaten. I talked a lot about it on After Nebrasketball when I was in and out of internet. What were your impressions of that game on Saturday?
Oh, a lot of this, again, if you look at a stat sheet compared to what your eyes told you, there was conflicting feelings on this game. But it comes back down to this, Caleb, that is not easy living. When you get yourself in the type of holes that Nebraska's all of a sudden found themselves in the last handful of games. And yes, because they were at Pinnacle Bank Arena and they had that charge back and eventually take the lead for a brief moment, you're thinking, okay, it's Northwestern all over again. They dodged a bullet. Obviously, you cannot go forward playing basketball like this and expect to have any type of long-term or postseason success. But here we are, just get closer to 19. I almost texted you right after the game, and I knew you were doing the post game, but we talked about this on Thursday. That runway is starting to shrink of trying to get to 19, because I think you and I are both in agreement. You get to 19, you feel like you're in. But along the way, you've now lost to Minnesota and Penn State. So as great as some of those quad ones and those solid victories that Nebraska's had, especially even going back earlier in the season, you start to offset a little bit of that with two things: losses to the bottom of your conference, but also the way you're trending at the end of the season, which is something the committee looks at. When you start putting all those teams that are on the bubble and you start looking at, okay, what was their last 10 games? What was the record in their last 10 games? How did they look in their conference tournament? All those things matter. And so I tweeted out, I think I used the words devastating and crushing as far as that type of loss. And that's how it felt. And it wasn't because all of a sudden Nebraska takes the lead on the putback by Juwan Gary, and then what he'd been doing pretty much all day, and Brendan Rigsby comes right back and knocks down a three, and all of a sudden it's lights out. I mean, yeah, that was tough, but it was the team you just lost to. It was the fact that you had to work that hard to take that type of a lead so late in the game that I continue to be overly concerned about the way this team functions offensively and really in the first half defensively. Minnesota is not a great shooting team, but they stayed very steady, above 50% from the field, above 45% beyond the arc. Those were numbers that if Nebraska was going to have success, if you say Nebraska holds Minnesota to 67 points, okay, you're probably okay with that to some extent. But when you start to see that they're extremely efficient field goal percentage-wise and beyond the arc, that's a problem. So it was the closeouts in the first half. It was the defense, not the rotation that we are typically used to seeing. There was sloppiness in the defense. And then offensively, Yeah, great to see Juwan Gary having a big game. Bryce Williams, we just kind of expect that anymore. But where's the secondary scoring? Okay, Connor Essegian gets in double figures, but where's the secondary scoring? Where's Burke now back for the second game? All of those things concerns me really, really badly right now as we're going into a 2-game stretch where, sure, yeah, you beat Ohio State and Lincoln, but given the way Nebraska's playing right now, does anybody have a lot of confidence that they can go into Columbus, Ohio and win that game? And then Iowa coming to PBA, sure, you felt like he let one slip away in Iowa City, but given the way Nebraska's playing right now, is playing at Pinnacle Bank Arena invincible anymore? No. So a lot of concern right now. There's really no way to sugarcoat that.
And there's a lot to be played for still. I know there's all the words. Fred after the game said he was absolutely sick. And I never like to get close to March and hear him say that because it gives me immediate PTSD to 2020 and watching him at the Big Ten tournament.
Seen Armand Gates slather on some hand sanitizer.
Like, guys, I don't know if this is okay. There's a lot of stories that came out of all of that. But for Nebraska, going into the weekend, Nebraska was one of the last 4 byes. As of yesterday, in for some other bracketology, they had Nebraska as one of those last 4 byes as well, kind of still sitting in that bubble range. As of yesterday, Joe Lunardi for ESPN had Nebraska sitting on the last 4 in line. Also in that same area on the last 4 byes, Ohio State.
Yep.
So you are looking at almost an elimination game coming up on Tuesday. You have that, and then at home with Iowa. Yes, you want to talk NCAA tournament. Right now, Fred Hoiberg needs to be talking with his team about making Indianapolis, making the Big Ten tournament, because this team is tied for 11th right now. And then USC and Iowa are tied for 15th. There are teams that Nebraska is going to face next Sunday. Nebraska is going to be facing a team playing to make the Big Ten tournament. In the same way that we saw Amy Williams' squad playing a team, they still needed some help, but they were playing for their season to make the conference tournament. Iowa most likely will be doing that this next Sunday as well. Nebraska, if you lose on Tuesday, you're playing to make the Big Ten tournament. Now, there are scenarios where the Huskers can make it in, even going 0-2 this week. And I don't want to live in that world where we watch this team go on a several-game losing streak, limping into the Big Ten tournament, knowing that the NCAA tournament is no longer an option.
Right.
I don't have the answers, Nick, because you look at this team, and they've been so Jekyll and Hyde that when things are going well, you go, okay, good. Bryce Williams is scoring. He's getting to the basket. He's making a bunch of free throws. Juwan Gary is kind of your next guy. And then Andrew Morgan will have 8 to 10. Essegian will hit 2 threes. Sam will hit a 3. Braxton Mia will get a dunk. Berke will score 8 points. Like you start to add in all of those things with the defense, and that's where Nebraska had success. All of those pieces have become extremely disparate of late, not just during the losing streak and then winning 5 out of 6 to answer that. I don't know that a lot of these guys know their role, which is concerning going into March.
I think that's fair. That's a fair assessment. And going back to some of the teams you just rattled off as far as what their chances in the path that they have, or either tied for the last team into the Big Ten tournament, or a team that could potentially either play their way in or play their way out, the desperation factor that these teams are going to have. Ohio State being on the bubble and being desperate to get into the NCAA tournament, knowing that you're going to get their best shot. Nebraska needs to be one of those teams.
I'm tired. When does Nebraska get to tap into the desperation?
Exactly.
And use that for itself.
100%. Nebraska needs to be that team that other coaches are saying, hey, this is a desperate team, okay? They are going to give that type of sense of urgency right out of the gate. I feel like we've said this so many times of, man, Nebraska's going to be going up against a desperate team. Nebraska's going to be going up against a desperate team. Nebraska's a desperate team right now. Let's be real with what they are right now. Because if you don't make the Big Ten tournament, you're not going to the NCAA tournament. That's not happening. Okay. And if you do get in somehow by going 0-2 this week, guess what? If anything short of being there on the Big Ten championship game, you're probably not going to the NCAA tournament. So there is a lot of things that Nebraska needs to get accomplished. But to me, it's in the first 5 minutes of each one of these next two games. What type of sense of urgency do they have? Is there that desperation, but not desperation where you're just chucking everything up? You're not wasting any shot clock or anything like that. You're the aggressor right from the get-go. The defense is present. It's evident right out of the gate. The rotation, that sense of urgency. I hate continuing to bring up this game, but I will until I'm blue in the face. And yes, I use blue because it's about Creighton. That sense of urgency that Nebraska showed defensively out of the gate in that game, from the very first possession, you're thinking, damn, okay, I like the way they're going to go about this. Look how they're defending Kalkbrenner, but look at how they're rotating back out, contesting shots, closing out. It looked so good, and they did that for 40 minutes. I get it. A lot of basketball's been played at this point. You're tired. The legs are tired. But everybody else in America is as well. That sense of urgency needs to start on the defensive side, because what is the identity of this basketball team right now? It's their defense. They set that tone in the very first possession. I think good things follow with the offense. I think then you see that desperation, that sense of urgency that this team needs to play with, that fire under their ass needs to happen, and it needs to happen that first minute tomorrow night in Columbus, Ohio.
And you saw that effort. I think you've obviously seen it in spurts, but to see it for 40 minutes, you saw it against Creighton, you saw it against Illinois. Maybe there's a 2-minute stretch that they took off against Illinois because Illinois makes that comeback. But you saw it at Oregon. Like, you've seen it in these games against ranked teams. Like, those aren't three nobodies,
right?
That you're talking about right there. And at the time, Nebraska had, you talk about those last two with Illinois and Oregon, Nebraska just lost 6 games in a row and then pulled that right back. Right now, Nebraska has lost 3 games in a row. Can you flip that switch against Ohio State on the road, knowing that you didn't get it done on Saturday, and you are playing for the Big Ten tournament as well as the NCAA tournament? You got to take care of number one, because guess what? If you're bottom 3 and you don't make the Big Ten tournament, I'm not having these conversations. But guess what? People get pretty loud talking about Fred Hoiberg's tenure. I'm not having that conversation, even if Nebraska loses out. But the people that have been having that conversation since December, good luck tuning them out.
Oh, and no, you're right. And here's the problem. I think this is why you're seeing Fred show so much frustration, is because everything seemed to really set up a lot earlier in the season for Nebraska of being a bona fide tournament team. And I still felt at the beginning of the season, given what you lost a year ago and trying to get a lot of these components in place to where they were, the chemistry and everything on the floor was starting to show up, that I thought this team, in an odd way, would be in a similar situation that they currently are in right now. Not trending in the wrong direction, but fighting for their tournament lives, where, boy, this will be a huge week for them. If they can get one of 2 of these games, they might find themselves on the better side of the bubble. But context is everything. And I think that's why Fred's frustrated, because they had, and I think in some ways still do, have the look of a tournament team. But Fred sees this team playing their way out. And I think that is going to make any coach in America livid, because all of the things that you were able to do in winning those big games, this team knows, they understand. It should be second nature to them. And now all of a sudden, you're reverting to some bad habits. There are different things that, again, these slow starts, all of a sudden, where did that come from? This last month of just getting behind the 8 ball against some very average to below average teams. And hey, look, every night shots aren't going to fall. I thought one of the most impressive wins that they had in that stretch was the win against Washington, when Washington could not miss, but Nebraska was steady in their offense the entire time. There was no panic, and they were on the road too, which is something that has not been traditionally good for Nebraska. So they've got things in their arsenal that I refuse to give up on. So you ask the question, can they flip that switch, and can they have that successful 40 minutes of basketball collectively enough to win a game against Ohio State. I still think they can, because when they were on that 6-game slide, you're thinking, are they ever going to win another game? And then they did, and they did it on the road, the improbable Nebraska road victory in conference play. So, yeah, they have it in them. But I think the frustration, the emotion that you're seeing from the fan base right now, I think is actually being set from Fred Hoiberg, because Fred is showing some emotion right now too. And I don't blame him. Fred's frustrated because he sees this team playing their way out. There was a little profanity. He said the things that these guys know in situations, they go over it all the time. And what is the most helpless feeling when you have veteran, older players that have played in a lot of college basketball that know all of these different situations and scenarios, yet in the moment, it eludes them. As a coach, you're helpless. I mean, what more can you say? You've been drilling that into their head all week long in preparation in the shoot-around. Then all of a sudden, in the moment that it matters the most, it's not happening. So I get his frustration. I get fans' frustration with this, because you're in a position right now of where you see this team playing themselves out of the tournament, and that is a very bad look for a team that looked like they were solidly in, as most recent as a week ago.
My parents are both teachers, and I coached a little bit, and I'm sure you've been around the same stuff. I know how frustrating it can be to drill and teach and teach and teach and teach, and then it becomes test time, and all of that just disappears into the ether.
Yeah, what do you always say? We went over this. Went over this.
Guys, I have been teaching you notes to the test for the last month and a half. What are we doing here? It is on a different level when it is a Division I men's basketball program, and it's not people doing this for the first time. Some of them are playing together for the first time, but it's not their first time playing basketball. And when there are simple just basketball things, that's the part that becomes frustrating. And I think that's one of the biggest frustrations for Fred Hoiberg right now. 8:00 tip, late night in Columbus. It'll be 9:00 local time there for him on Tuesday. And then we'll have another show before Nebraska closes out the regular season senior day at home with Iowa. Now, it was also a little bit of a disappointing weekend on the diamond for Nebraska baseball. 1-2 at the Frisco College Baseball Classic down in Texas. Opened up with an 8-3 win over Sam Houston, led 5-0 against number 2 LSU, ultimately fall 11-6. And then it was a 9-6 loss to K-State on Sunday, a team that is scheduled, Nebraska and Kansas State are scheduled to play 2 more times this season. You weren't down there. It was up to your buddies on the Huskers Radio Network on the call, but from sitting back comfy at home, taking in all of it, what were your thoughts on Will Bolt's squad this weekend going 1-2 in Texas?
Loved Friday. Loved everything about Friday, with the exception, and hopefully we're crossing our fingers that it's nothing overly serious. You would hate to see Mason McConaughey out for an extended period of time, but he had to leave the game with some elbow stuff going on there. But boy, you're hoping that he is going to be at least back at some point. That would be huge. But I everything about Friday against Sam Houston I loved, because this team throughout the week of preparation was challenged to be more competitive in their at bats. Reducing the called strike threes, reducing the weak contact pull side ground balls, all of those things that will really challenge this team. I thought collectively this group did a great job, really 1 through 9. I mean, Hogan Haligzo as the 9-hole hitter, getting a couple of hits. Guy I told you about last week, keep your eye on too, had a huge weekend, batted 500. Devin Nunez was outstanding. So, inside
the park home run, because they didn't call it a home run.
I know. I think everybody, it was great watching him round second and trotting all of a sudden, oh gosh, I better go. But yeah, so the approach offensively, I thought defensively, and give a lot of credit. Another guy that I want to make sure I mentioned too, Will Walsh, who had a tough one against Louisiana in that start in game 3 of that series, bounced back in relief, coming off of Jalen Worthley when Jalen came in for Mason McConaughey. And Will threw great, did exactly what he needed to do to close out that game, to never feel really threatened there in the latter half of that game. Then we get to Saturday in the LSU game. And this was tough for me because I was doing PA announcing for UNO hockey that night. So I'm in my car, so I'm listening to the game. Then I get in my car and LSU puts a couple runs up. So I go into the arena when it's 5-3 Nebraska. So at that point, I'm at the mercy of checking Twitter the entire time. And all of a sudden, I'm not getting any updates. So then I go to our wonderful scribes who cover Husker baseball with Evan Bland and Michael Bruntz. And so then I'm kind of going off of what they're saying and how they're describing what they're hearing and seeing. And then I talked to Ben yesterday. We do our little post-trip rundown if either one of us isn't there, our debriefing, if you will. And you really look at a couple of plays here and there, especially in that seventh inning where you could get out of that inning at 7-5 and you're still within striking distance, yet a decision to try to make a play. We saw this in Louisiana as well when it came to picking up a ball, whether it's a swinging bunt or an actual bunt. We saw this with Will Walsh and Drew Christo against Louisiana, either having a problem picking up the ball or making a throw where you didn't need to make. And it just all of a sudden the merry-go-round gets going and you end up giving up a huge crooked number in the seventh inning. Little things like that. I know we could play the what could have been or shoulda, woulda, coulda, but where would that game have been if you get out of that only trailing 7-5? Yeah, you lick your wounds on that, but you're still 2 down against a team that you really had been on their pitching for most of the game, as opposed to all of a sudden just a devastating blow to add, 3 more runs on top of that before you get out of the inning, and all of a sudden you're down 10-5. That's demoralizing, especially for what was an 80-20 sold-out crowd, but 80% in favor of LSU. So they're feeling it. They're on top of you. You feel like you just let one slip away, but you still got 2 more innings to try to plug away at this thing, and just a real tough scenario there. And then yesterday felt a lot like what we saw in that final game against Louisiana, where the at-bats weren't all that competitive. It was a team that I feel like in the batter's box was pressing a lot as well. That it just, again, I think this team understands the type of season they can have. And when they're not getting maybe some of those at-bats collectively that they want to get right out of the gate, there's a little bit of pressure, I think. And I'm not saying this is being put on by the coaching staff. I really don't. I think these guys have a expectation and a standard where you can watch certain at-bats, especially certain veterans in this lineup, that are just putting so much on themselves. Again, got to mention, not only Devin Nunes had one, Cale Frost. Great to see that too. Cale Frost, that's huge, because there's another guy that I think he knew anytime his name was mentioned, it was always the Summit League Player of the Year, the Summit League Player of the Year. And the guy's going 16 at-bats without getting a hit. You're feeling it. And I love the way that the coaching staff handled him. They gave him a couple of games here and there off to process. Hey, that worked out well. He was a great at-bat. So amongst some of the things that we saw a week ago against Louisiana, there were also bright spots as well. If you say 1-2 in a weekend like that, there's going to be disappointment, but I think the context is also important with it as well.
You're seeing those spurts, obviously, like you had brought up, Devin Nunes the last couple of weekends, Cale Frost getting going this weekend, obviously Gabe Swanson opening weekend. But overall, and this isn't kind of like, nobody is immune to this. This weekend in particular, 10 strikeouts Friday, 8 strikeouts Saturday, 11 on Sunday. Those are some, and I know you would, I think when we talked last week, you said strikeout numbers are up across college baseball.
They are.
But for this Nebraska team and the expectations, and you want to host a regional, and Will Bolt continues to say that that's the expectation coming into every season, is to get back to in the conversation to hosting a regional. With those kind of strikeout numbers, without a lot of runs going up on the other end, that's worrisome for me early on.
Yeah, and it is a fair concern. I think when you get the swing and misses, are you looking at the at-bat itself? Was it a battle, and then all of a sudden the guy just all of a sudden was able to pump one by you? The ones that concern me, and I talked about this last week, the ones that concern me more than anything in the Louisiana series, and you saw a little bit of this yesterday too, was the called strike threes. And no, not because, that ump was blind. No, because you look like you might be either overthinking it. You don't have a feel in the batter's box is what I always chalk that up to. Of a pitcher, you got to tip your cap to them if their pitch sequence is solid and they're able to work those in to where they're getting ahead of you, and then you're trying to hit on their terms. But when you're not even attempting to swing it, it tells me that you're not seeing it. You don't have a true feel for it. And maybe there's a confidence thing where you're lost in thought, if you will. There are going to be times where a guy just pulls the string on you or comes back at you with a backdoor slider, and it's just a beautiful pitch, and it buckles you, and you turn and look at the catcher like, yep, that was a good one. But when you see enough of them, you start wondering, okay, that's more of what's going on in the batter's box, because I know this team communicates. I know when even if a guy goes down looking or swinging, he's going back and he is communicating with that on-deck hitter immediately of what he's seeing. So that's not an issue. I think this is the individual. I think, and this is where I go back to, that's why I bring up the pressing situation. You know, guys like Gabe Swanson, guys that, you know, are more than capable of erupting at any moment, but when they're not having the type of at-bats that they expect from themselves, you start to question a lot of those different things that you already know. You start to overthink things. And then trying to get back on that simple mindset and that simple approach can be extremely challenging. And unfortunately, there's more than just two guys in the lineup that are experiencing this, in my opinion. The good news is they've all gone through this at some point in their college career, and they've battled through it. We saw how Gabe Swanson ended last season.
Yeah.
So I don't think that the confidence level by the Nebraska fans should be so low that this group is going to be so Jekyll and Hyde when it comes to the offense. But now's the time, because with that expanded Big Ten, conference play begins this weekend at home. So this is where that's that learning curve, or that, hey, we need to get things figured out at the right time, needs to happen a little earlier, because these are those weekends now. It's go time. Yeah, you want to have success against these tough teams that you're playing in non-conference, but at the very least, you got to start taking care of business, especially when you open up conference play at home. So, yeah, there's pressure on this team right now.
I want to talk Washington and the Big Ten Conference as a whole the week ahead, but we talked about at the plate. What about on the other side defensively? The pitchers over these first few weekends, especially this weekend because it's the most recent, but the free passes and the number of hits, and obviously you get an error at any time as a pitcher, and you're like, man, I was throwing all right. I gave up a couple hits. I was throwing all right, but an error kind of snowballs things. So there's that aspect behind the pitchers. But on the hill, there are a number of hits being given out, and there are a lot. Obviously, one is more than you want to, but there are a lot of free passes being given as well.
Yeah, and that was the auspicious start I think that Nebraska got off to, going all the way back to the season opener against Irvine. Is everybody who came into that game, starting with Mason, was uncharacteristically not wild, but trying to be too fine in the strike zone, where they were just missing. It wasn't wild misses necessarily, but it was knowing that you're trying to attack a spot, but just not hitting that spot. And yeah, sometimes maybe you're not getting a certain pitch, but as every pitcher has to, just like every hitter has to, you have to adjust. As long as it's consistently called a certain way, you have to adjust to that. That's just baseball. So that was a little uncharacteristic. I thought in Arizona, Nebraska did a better job as the tournament progressed of reducing the free passes. I thought last week against Louisiana, until you got in the middle of that series, I talked about Mason's bounce back in that start against Louisiana, did great, and again, limited any type of free passes. And I think there are going to be moments that those numbers might inflate a little bit. As long as that's not the growing trend, as opposed to maybe more of an anomaly. And then I also look at who their pitching coach is too, and what he teaches, what he preaches, and the veteran arms that, as he likes to say, mastering the vanilla, and simply put, just getting that first pitch over for strike one and immediately having the advantage on the mound as opposed to in the batter's box, is what this pitching staff is trained on, is what they're taught. And I think for the most part, they have that in them. And there's some power arms. This is the other thing about this staff is, and this is the good and bad thing of that. When you see somebody up there, whether it's a freshman or a sophomore, I mean, Blake Encarnacion's throwing 94, 95 yesterday. And that's exciting. You're like, oh my gosh, we got guys that can touch 96, 97. Carson Yasa can get to 99. But getting those guys to hone in that adrenaline to where, yep, you still want that explosiveness with the fastball, but are you able to drill that in the strike zone? Are you pounding that in the strike zone? And for those younger guys, that's the adjustment. Because think about it, Kaleb, when you're in high school, you can be outside the zone. And with pure intimidation of 90-plus stuff, you're going to get high school hitters that are going to swing and miss because they're freaked out by that.
Yep.
Unless you're throwing it to the backstop, if it's even close to the zone, they're freaked out by that. College hitters, they're disciplined. 95 mile an hour doesn't overwhelm them. They're looking for spots. And if you're not hitting that spot, and if you're not hitting the strike zone, they're going to lay off. And all of a sudden, you're like, whoa, I'm throwing 95. You're supposed to be swinging this because you're scared. Well, they're not scared. So I think that's a lot with the younger guys too. Now, defensively on the whole, I would say this. There is, in the Dylan Carey error, was that really an error? That's a tough call, in my opinion. That's the only position player that has committed an error. Other than that, we've seen pitchers make errors in fielding bunts and a throwing error. So I still think the guys behind the pitcher and what we've seen between Heligzo and I'll even throw in Jeske too, Will Jeske, behind the dish. Symbolista's come in a couple of times in just some spots. I think really collectively the defense has been good. Now, as I say, we've had now 3 pitchers that have not handled either a swinging bunt or a bunt great. Well, that's going to be part of the scouting report for the opposition. So they're going to continue to challenge the pitchers of coming off the mound and trying to make plays and seeing if they can make the simple, hey, we're going to give you an out. Can you successfully pick up the baseball and make an accurate throw? Sounds simple, PFP, as everyone knows, but that has been a little bit of an issue. But as far as the infield and the outfield making plays, a lot more great defensive plays than we've seen shaky plays. So I still think collectively the defense from that standpoint is in good shape.
All right, out of the South now, 4-6 after those 3 weekends, hitting a bunch of Southern states, coming back. Supposed to be at Omaha tomorrow, and then home opener Wednesday afternoon before the Big Ten opener this weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday against Washington. Before the Big Ten, Omaha and South Dakota State. Look at those teams, but also we're seeing a lot of weather moving through all of a sudden. Potentially getting cold enough for some overnight snows Tuesday into Wednesday. Woo-hoo. What are you guys hearing on? I mean, you're an Omaha guy. You're seeing that weather a lot more than I am. But potential to not have the first game back here in Nebraska?
Well, the good news is I think the weekend, other than Friday, maybe being a little bit cooler and chance of rain and snow, Saturday and Sunday look very good. Heck, I think Sunday looks like it's in the mid-60s. So I feel great about that Washington series happening in some way, shape, or form. Everything I was hearing over the weekend from the folks at Omaha being there for hockey, I know that they were monitoring very closely. And then I don't know if you got the same thing I did this morning. All of a sudden we get the winter weather watch notification on our phone thinking, oh, come on now. So it's an all-turf field at Tal Anderson, but here's the problem. I know Omaha, and I don't blame them for this. Omaha is going to want to be able to maximize that gate. So if you're somehow moving the first pitch up, and I don't even know if that's on the table, but if there's a window that you can get it in, if you're able to move that up, if you're Omaha, are you able to maximize what you're going to get out of the gate when Nebraska comes? No.
There's 20 people there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the good news is these are both regional teams, one obviously just 45 minutes away, that I hope it's early enough in the season where you can look at and say, hey, we only have one midweek game this week. We could double up there. South Dakota State, you could do the same thing with them, especially, and I haven't even looked at their schedule when they play Omaha, but maybe you can figure out something when they're playing Omaha if Nebraska is clear as well. So I would think that right now, if I had to make a guess, I would say it's 75-25 that we don't see midweek baseball this week. That's just what I'm going to throw out there.
All right. Well, just like Jordan said, probably not playing till the weekend. Saturday at best. Thanks for listening. Yeah. Jordan, we'll get to Washington and the Big Ten Conference on our Thursday show. Maybe talk about if a midweek game was played, but a lot happened the last few days out in Indianapolis for former Huskers, as you had Ty Robinson, Thomas Fedoni, Isaiah Nayor, and Tommy Hill all out there trying to impress teams ahead of the draft, which is next month. Yes, because we are into March. Now we can say the NFL draft is next month. Nebraska's Pro Day coming up later this month. You started out well, really well, with Ty Robinson and what he was able to do. He was moving. Thomas Fidone looked like he moved really well. He was super explosive. And then you did not see Tommy Hill perform because he still has that ankle that he's nursing, not 100% healthy. So we went through the interviews. We'll see if he comes back for Nebraska's Pro Day, March 25th. And then Isaiah Nayor, he, again, super athletic, what you saw there. Not all of that lines up with, especially those last two that performed with Fidone and Nayor. That doesn't necessarily line up with their production that you saw on the field at Nebraska. But when you're up there in the underwear Olympics, it's about how athletic you are and what kind of numbers you put up. So what did you take away from seeing some of these guys running around, making big jumps, and Fidone looked like he was catching the ball well in some of those drills?
I would actually start with Fidone. And not that I didn't expect him not to test well, but I know that Thomas Fidone is one of those guys that we were always left with wanting to see more because of the ceiling that Thomas Fidone has always had. And I think it's always important to remind folks the devastation that his knees went through in his time at Nebraska. But watching him move around, the hands were good. The acceleration, I know the comparison was made that he's built like the Terminator. That's not bad. I don't think that's a negative when people are labeling you as the Terminator. But he's one of those guys that I think are a handful of guys in the draft that if you look at the career numbers at their respective programs, don't maybe necessarily line up to what you see from the individual and the individual workouts. I think there is so much potential there with Thomas Fidone. I think there's a lot of draftable potential there with Thomas Fidone based on what you saw, just the glimpse that you saw at the workout, because the speed looks like it's definitely there. It doesn't look like there is any holding back whatsoever. And you're right. I mean, he was catching the ball. He was doing everything so smoothly. And he graded out in a lot of the categories in the top 4 tight ends. I think he had the 4th best 40 time amongst all tight ends that tested out, which is great. The other big takeaway I had, when you are 6'5", 288 pounds, and you are running a sub 540, these are the nightmares that I would have if I was a running back or a quarterback or a wide receiver or anybody on the offensive side. Ty Robinson running that 40, and I know a lot of us watched that on Thursday. God, when he started getting some steam, it almost looked like he shouldn't be able to run that fast. Like they were doing something, little CGI technology. Yes. So yeah, he was like one on the airport skywalk things or whatever. It was just, it was mind blowing. And I've talked about this with Ty. I think we're just scratching the surface with him because there was a moment before Matt Rule and the staff got there that I think there was that belief that Ty Robinson was almost getting burnt out because remember, Casey Rogers leaves. They didn't have a lot of depth on that defensive line. And then in comes that first wave of freshmen alongside of the emergence of Nash. You have 2 now solid defensive interior linemen. And then you get even though Princewell's no longer here, but you get the edge guys like Princewell, Cam Lenhart, Riley Van Poppel. You start getting some of those transfers, MJ and all those guys being able to contribute. And all of a sudden you're unlocking Ty Robinson. I think he's not that he hadn't been a good player before, but all of a sudden you had guys around you that were allowing him to get some one-on-one battles and really show the type of dominance that he can show. And his game continued to evolve. So I think we're just scratching the surface on Ty Robinson. I think that might be the prevailing thought after the combine of this guy only got better from year 1 to year 2 as a full-time starter in the Tony White defense. So I think there's a lot of buzz on him. Isaiah Nayor, I'm not surprised either because the length of him. Now, what was the other issue with him? Could he catch the ball?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. He did fine. He's got the speed, and that there is that NFL type length that you want to see at the wide receiving position. So the way that those guys tested, I'm not surprised. The guys that I think benefit the most off of how they tested, and we'll see, as you mentioned, with Pro Day as well, I think are Ty. And honestly, Tommy Hill did not work out. If anybody's wondering why we're not talking about Tommy Hill, he did not work out at the combine, right. Just did the interviews and everything, and he'll work out at the Pro Day. So that's going to be interesting to see how he does. But I think based on what Thomas Fidone was able to do, more than anything, showing the scouts that the injuries are behind him, I think are very big for his possibility of hearing his name called. And then Ty Robinson, I think for a guy that's projected to be a day 2 or day 3 guy, maybe he's squarely on the day 2 level right now, which it would be tremendous. Cause I think wherever he lands, he's going to impact the team, I think, sooner rather than later.
I think just on testing alone, you saw all 3 guys that went out and did the on-field drills helped themselves.
Yeah.
When you went through all of that. Robinson seemed like he helped himself the most with where he potentially was able to go. Mm-hmm. Like we said, Fidone and Naor both had the overall production, just wasn't maybe what you would think lines up with where they are athletically. How's this? So the relative athletic score that one of these guys gives out, I'm going to click on it just so I can make sure I give it correctly. You can go to ras.football, and it goes through and it combines all of their scores from the testing. Mm-hmm. And it also spits out comparative scores. This is the part that I found very intriguing. So with Ty Robinson, mm-hmm. his RAS comparisons include, and I'm going to butcher some of these names because I didn't really cover them, but Taven Bryan from Florida in 2018. Mm-hmm. That was a first-round draft pick.
Yep.
Rook Orhorora from Clemson in 2024. He was a second-round draft pick. And Keon White from Georgia Tech in 2023. He was a second-round draft pick. Yep. Those are all the immediate comparisons when you add in all of that testing for what they did. And that's not just how fast they ran, how high they jumped. That includes body size. That includes all of your measurables with that as well. For Thomas Fidone, which, by the way, his broad jump was number 1 out of all of the tight ends there. That was stupid insane.
I think he reminded us how much of a freak athlete he is at the combines. And that's why the combines and the workouts are good for people like that maybe didn't have the career numbers, but you're like, Jesus, there's something there. And there is with Thomas Fidone. We know that.
Yeah. And for Fidone, Stephen Sullivan from LSU 2020, Greg Dulcich from UCLA 2022, Tanner McLaughlin from Arizona 2024, 7th, 3rd, and 6th rounds, respectively. Here is the one that this was most eye-popping for me. And you haven't read my story at Husker Max, right? So this isn't going to be – okay, no. Good.
You're surprising me.
Good. The relative athletic score comparisons for Isaiah Naor. One of them was Isaiah Weston from Northern Iowa in 2022. He went undrafted. Mm-hmm. The other 2 – Calvin Johnson and Julio Jones.
Hey, they're not bad.
Top 10 picks. And the reason being is because of how big Isaiah Naor is.
Yes.
So that's the part where the measurables came in. And know what you were able to see Calvin Johnson do at Georgia Tech, Julio Jones do at Alabama. No, Isaiah Naor did not do that in Lincoln. You know? Right. So that's the production side of it.
We didn't have mini Megatron in Lincoln, we know.
Yeah. When you're looking at strictly the measurables and the athleticism and the explosiveness, Naor has put himself in a position to be one of those end-of-roster guys, at the very least practice squad, because if he can get it going, the ceiling is very high for him.
Yeah.
Because of what he is athletically and what his size is. I know we didn't see it in Lincoln, and this was one of you saw the conversations, is what I'll call them, on social media over the weekend. We all know where Thomas Fidone was, but with Isaiah Naor, it was, well, why didn't you scheme him open more? Why didn't you try to get him the ball more? Well, he dropped the ball a number of times.
He did.
And I think that's a skill that can be improved.
Yeah.
What's a harder thing to improve? How big you are, how tall you are, how long your arms are. And to take those and be explosive and fast and agile. And those are the things that Isaiah Naor showed this weekend that I think are going to help him on day 3 with finding a home.
Yeah, I think the NFL draft is a little unique compared to Major League Baseball and the NBA from the simple standpoint of those two that I mentioned between MLB and NBA are a little bit more based on potential, almost weighing potential in more than proven track record. I think for the NFL, there is more on proven track record, but potential definitely has its place in it. And so the part about Isaiah Nayor is, you're right. I mean, the length, the hand size, all of those things, either you have that or you don't. Now, if you have that, that's going to get you a few more eyeballs, despite what your track record at the previous places you were at would tell you. If you're on the other side of that, where not the biggest guy, hands are mid-size, speed is mid, but dang, you were productive. And man, winning a lot of 50-50 balls, a lot of those little things, those intangibles that you can go back to the productions, the stats in the film and say, well, what he lacks for overall size physically, we know the ability is there. So I think for Isaiah Nayor, and here's the other thing, if we're going to be fair about Thomas Fidone and the injuries that I think he showed the scouts that he's over, you got to do that with Isaiah Nayor too, because this was a guy that was also, had an ACL as well. So, I think there's a little bit of that. Guys that have that injury history, whether it was a lot more unfortunate for Thomas Fidone than it was for Isaiah Nayor as far as the amount of them that they have, that's the first thing you're watching if you're a scout is, how are they moving? Does it look like there are any setbacks? Does it look like, if I were to look at this guy not knowing his injury history, would I be able to point something out? I'd be like, oh, I bet he had an ACL, or I bet he had an MCL, or he had an ankle or something. And if the answer is no, I wouldn't know that. That's great for both of them. So if anything I take away from Thomas Fidone, but especially Isaiah Nayor as well, is that they're showing scouts that they're past that, and that maybe in those interviews you can talk about, my lack of production a little bit had to do with the physical part. Still was working back, maybe didn't mentally feel right off that leg, or off, in Thomas Fidone's case, both legs. Mm-hmm. And so I think there are organizations that can listen to that could factor that in, and then can watch the workouts and say, damn, this is hard to pass up. Even if this is a 6th or 7th round type of thing that we're looking to do, we see this is where that potential thing kicks in. We see the potential there, and we think this could be big for us.
All right, those 4 guys that were in Indianapolis, I'm going to give you a snap question here. We'll throw in Nash, too, who was not invited to the Combine. Those 5 guys, day 1, 2, or 3, just initially, where do you see each one lining up?
I'm going to say Ty is day 2. I think he worked himself into that conversation where he's day 2. I think your next guy is probably, I still think Fidone gets it. I think he's day 3. Tommy Hill, I'll be curious to see how he works out, because remember, at one point he was considered to be a potential
late first
rounder. Exactly. But I still think he's a day 3. I think corners and the way he's built, that's still something that's always hard to come by, but I think he will get drafted. I have a tough time believing Nash won't, but I think Nash will definitely be on the back end. Isaiah Nayor, I could go either way with it. Right now I'll say UDFA, but I think Ty will lead the charge. I think he's a day 2 guy.
Yeah, Nayor is kind of that one sitting on that line. Nash a little bit too, but because of the measurables, I think Nayor, you might find a coaching staff that says, let's get him in the 7th.
Yeah.
Let's get him at the end here, so we don't have to go through any negotiating. He's just ours.
Yep.
And you bring him in because of the size, and you see what you can work with. And who knows if that moves, say, like Thomas Fidone up around or something as well. And man, Robinson helped himself. Ty Robinson helped himself quite a bit. We'll still keep an eye on where baseball is for midweek. If they don't play, we'll be back on Thursday to talk about missing 2 games, potentially having them made up later. But Washington coming to town this weekend. Softball had a winning weekend this down in Wichita, split with Missouri. So there's a lot going on with the Diamond Sports. Husker basketball on the road. The men at Ohio State on Tuesday, the women in the Big Ten tournament on Wednesday. Big thank you to Matt Coatney for joining us, breaking down where Amy Williams' squad is heading into that Big Ten tournament. Nick, stay warm up there in the icy tundra of Omaha this week. We'll talk again on Thursday, all right?
Sounds good.
All right, we'll see all of you right back here. Husker Max YouTube page, 9 a.m. Thursday. Go Big Red.